Hello everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel, The Knowledge Library. Today we are here to discuss some of the important MCQs from the topic of constitutional development. So let us begin. Our first question is, through which one of the following were commercial activities of the East India Company finally put on an end? Option A, the Charter Act of 1793. Option B, the Charter Act of 1813. Option C, the Charter Act of 1833, and option D, the Charter Act of 1853. The correct answer is option C, the Charter Act of 1833. Moving on to the next question. Which act for the first time made it possible for Indians to take some share in the administration of their country? Option A, Charter Act of 1833. Option B, the Charter Act of 1853. Option C, Government of India Act 1858, and option D, Indian Council Act of 1861. The correct answer is option A, the Charter Act of 1833. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following acts of British had separated legislative from executive? Option A, Pitt's India Act 1784. Option B, the Regulating Act of 1773. Option C, the Settlement Act of 1781. And option D, the Charter Act of 1853. The correct answer is option B, the Charter Act of 1853. Moving on to the next question. In which of the following acts the territorial division of the governance in India was done? Option A, Government of India Act 1858. Option B, Indian Council Act 1861. Option C, Indian Council Act 1892, and option D, Government of India Act 1861. The correct answer is option A, Government of India Act 1858. Moving on to the next question. The act that transferred the power from the British East India Company to the British Crown in India was? Option A, Government of India Act 1833. Option B, Government of India Act 1947. Option C, Government of India Act 1858, and option D, Government of India Act 1835. The correct answer is option C, Government of India Act 1858. The next question is, which of the following vested the Secretary of State for India with the supreme control over the Government of India? Option A, Pitt's India Act 1784. Option B, Government of India Act 1858. Option C, Indian Council Act 1861, and option D, Morley Minto Reforms 1909. The correct answer is option B, Government of India Act 1858. The next question is, the first attempt to introduce a representative and popular element in the governance of India was made through? Option A, Indian Council Act of 1861. Option B, Indian Council Act of 1892. Option C, Indian Council Act of 1909, and option D, Government of India Act 1919. The correct answer is option A, India Council Act of 1861. The next question is, which among the following acts was passed by the British Parliament to increase in size the legislative councils? Option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, Pitt's India Act of 1784. Option C, India Council Act of 1892, and option D, Indian Council Act of 1919. The correct answer is option C, Indian Council Act of 1892. Moving on to the next question. By which of the following acts Legislative Council of India received the power to discuss the budget? Option A, Indian Council Act 1861. Option B, Indian Council Act 1892. Option C, Indian Council Act 1909, and option D, Indian Council Act of 1919. The correct answer is option B, Indian Council Act of 1892. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following acts provided for communal representation in British India? Option A, Indian Council Act of 1892. Option B, Morley Minto Reforms of 1909. Option C, Montagu-Chelmsford Reform of 1919, and option D, Government of India Act of 1935. The correct answer is option B, Morley Minto Reforms of 1909. The next question is, the Morley Minto Reform was declared in the year Option A 1907, option B 1909, option C 1911, and option D 1919. The correct answer is option B 1909. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following acts introduced communal elections in India? Option A Indian Council Act of 1861, option B Indian Council Act of 1892, option C Indian Council Act of 1909, and option D Government of India Act of 1935. The correct answer is option C Indian Council Act of 1909. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following acts introduced separate electorate for Muslims? Option A Act of 1892, option B Act of 1909, option C Reforms of 1919, and option D Government of India Act of 1935. The correct answer is option B Act of 1909. Moving on to the next question. Which Government of India Act allowed some elected representation in the legislature for the first time? Option A Government of India Act 1858, option B Government of India Act 1909, option C Government of India Act 1919, and option D Government of India Act 1935. The correct answer is option B Government of India Act 1909. The next question is, the Act of 1909 was associated with option A introduction of separate electorate, option B decentralization, option C diarchy, and option D legislative councils. The correct answer is option A introduction of separate electorate. Moving on to the next question. The Indian legislature was made bicameral for the first time by option A Indian Council Act of 1892, option B Indian Council Act of 1909, and option C the Government of India Act of 1919, and option D the Government of India Act 1935. The correct answer is option C Government of India Act 1919. The next question is, diarchy was first introduced under the option A Parliamentary reforms, option B Montfort reforms, option C Simon Commission plan, and option D Government of India Act 1935. The correct answer is option B Montfort reforms. The next question is, which of the following acts was described by Jawaharlal Nehru as the Charter of Slavery? Option A Regulating Act of 1773, option B Pitt's India Act of 1784, option C Government of India Act of 1919, and option D Government of India Act 1935. The correct answer is option D Government of India Act 1935. Moving on to the next question. The distribution of powers between the center and state in the Indian Constitution is based on the scheme provided in the option A Parliamentary reforms 1909, option B Montagu-Chelmsford reform 1935, option C Government of India Act 1935, and option D Indian Independence Act 1947. The correct answer is option C Government of India Act 1935. The next question is, by which of the following acts the system of diarchy was introduced at the center? Option A 1909, option B 1919, option C 1935, and option D 1947. The correct answer is option C 1935. Moving on to the next question. In the federation established by the Government of India Act of 1935, residuary powers were given to the option A Federal Legislature, option B Governor General, option C Provincial Legislature, and option D Provincial Governors. The correct answer is option B Governor General. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following acts introduced the principle of constitutional autocracy? Option A, the Indian Council Act of 1909. Option B, the Government of India Act of 1919. Option C, the Government of India Act of 1934. And option D, the Government of India Act of 1947. The correct answer is option C, the Government of India Act 1934. The next question is, which of the following acts provided for the establishment of Reserve Bank of India? Option A, the Government of India Act 1919. Option B, the Government of India Act 1935. Option C, Indian Independence Act of 1947. And option D, RBI Act of 1935. The correct answer is option B, the Government of India Act of 1935. Moving on to the next question. Which one of the following acts reserved seats for women in the legislatures in accordance with the allocation of seats for different communities? Option A, the Government of India Act 1858. Option B, the Indian Councils Act of 1909. Option C, the Government of India Act 1919. And option D, the Government of India Act 1935. The correct answer is option D, the Government of India Act of 1935. The creation of a federal court in India was associated by which of the following acts or commissions? Option A, the Government of India Act 1919. Option B, the Lee Commission 1923. Option C, the Government of India Act 1935. And option D, the Indian Councils Act of 1909. The correct answer is option C, Government of India Act of 1935. The Indian Independence Act was passed in option A, July 1947. Option B, June 1946. Option C, August 1947. And option D, August 1946. The correct answer is option A, July 1947. Moving on to the next question. By which of the following acts the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of East India Company in India? Option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, Pitt's India Act of 1784. Option C, Charter Act of 1830. And option D, Charter Act of 1793. The correct answer is option A, Regulating Act of 1773. The next question is, in which of the following acts the provision was made for the establishment of Supreme Court at Calcutta? Option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, Charter Act of 1813. Option C, Pitt's India Act of 1784. And option D, Charter Act of 1833. The correct answer is option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Moving on to the next question. The first definite step to provide parliamentary control over East India Company was taken by option A, the Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Option C, the Charter Act of 1793. And option D, the Charter Act of 1813. The correct answer is option A, the Regulating Act of 1773. The next question is, which act passed by the British Parliament to address the shortcomings of the Regulating Act of 1773 is also known as the East India Company Act of 1784? Option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, India Council Act of 1861. Option C, Pitt's India Act of 1784. And option D, Government of India Act of 1858. The correct answer is option C, Pitt's India Act of 1784. The act during the regime of East India Company responsible for paving the way for shipment of opium to China is option A, Settlement Act of 1781. Option B, Charter Act of 1793. Option C, Charter Act of 1784. And option D, none of the above. The correct answer is option C, Charter Act of 1793. The next question is, which act of British Parliament abolished the East India Company monopoly over trade in India? Option A, Regulating Act of 1773. Option B, Pitt's India Act of 1784. Option C, Charter Act of 1813, and option D, none of the above. The correct answer is option C, Charter Act of 1813.
Like, share and subscribe our channel.